Hi, this is the Invisible Waters newsletter. I am here today with Caroline Tracey, who's a writer and geographer, and has a new book coming out called Salt Lakes that will be out in March of 2026. I luckily got my hands on a copy of it, so I've read it. It's excellent. I've been waiting a very, very long time for the book. It is about salt lakes across the world, and um, it weaves history, anthropology, geography, and kind of life experience, Caroline's own life experiences with these lakes, looking at the decline of salt lakes and the resilience of salt lakes. And I am really just lucky to be with Caroline today to talk more about the book. I followed her journalism for a really, really long time. And yeah, I'm excited to dive in because I think salt lakes are really magical, mystical, beautiful places, and often overlooked. So to see an entire book dedicated to them across the globe was very exciting for me. And I just consumed this book once I got my hands on a copy. So without further ado, Caroline, I'll let you introduce yourself a little bit and talk about this project and sort of how it came together.
Sure. Thank you, Daniel. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for having me. I'm thrilled that the book has an audience in you and hopefully other readers too. But I'm so thrilled that you enjoyed the book. So, um, Salt Lakes, full title is Salt Lakes: An Unnatural History, and it's coming out from the publisher W. Norton in March 2026, March 17th. And the book, like you mentioned, it weaves together history, life experience, science, a number of different sort of disciplines. And I guess to your question about how it came about, it's been a long process. The second chapter of the book I wrote as an essay and published in 2015. So basically exactly a decade. This book has been underway. I started, I guess, in my early 20s driving around the Great Basin and was pretty surprised to see so many salt lakes. I didn't really know they existed. I guess I knew about Great Salt Lake and maybe a handful of others around the world, but I didn't realize that they were such an important feature of the American West. And so that started me on this long journey, long odyssey of learning about the lakes, learning about why they're in decline, and talking to people who are involved in trying to study them and save them.
What makes these salt lakes so unique, and what really made you gravitate toward them?
I think that there are many things that make them unique. I mean, you could sort of say geologically they're unique because they occur in closed valleys. Ecologically, they're unique because they have really different food chains than other places. But in terms of what made them unique in a way that made me gravitate to them, I think had a lot to do with them aesthetically almost. That one thing that is interesting about salt lakes is that because the water has a lot of minerals dissolved in it, they are more reflective than normal lakes. And so when you are in the desert, because they occur in closed valleys, and so those mainly occur in desert regions, because if it were not a desert, there would be enough water to actually sort of carve an outlet through the valley. So when you're driving around in the desert, you see a salt lake, and not only is it a lake, but it's particularly blue and particularly reflective and particularly glistening. And so I think I found them just very surprising and beautiful. And that was what drew me to them initially.
Yeah, I love one of the things I really love about the book is how seamlessly it kind of weaves the history of these places with the present kind of situation that these lakes are in, with also sort of your own personal experiences of experiencing the lakes, but also just sort of things that are going, processing the lakes as you're processing things going on in your own life. And these essays kind of beautifully weave all these different strands together. I'm wondering how you went about doing that and thinking about place in a way that incorporates so much of the past and the present?
That's a great question. It's kind of the biggest question, I guess. I mean, I think there's one answer that is that I was approaching the writing of these chapters as kind of personal essays. And so I think what distinguishes a personal essay from a geographic essay, right, is that you're learning something about yourself in the process of writing it. At the same time, though, I think I also later came to think of them as also geographic essays. And so therefore I wanted to learn something about the place in the process of writing them. And so my hope is that they are each kind of a synthesis of both of those things, where I was both learning about the place and learning about myself, and that there are really two arcs that go together over the course of the story. But I think that in terms of the process of writing, in many of the chapters, the personal essay came first, especially in the early chapters. And then I did a lot of the reporting and research after I kind of wrote the travelogue and personal narrative sections. That's less true, I guess, in the later chapters. Some of the later chapters, I really approached research first, personal narrative second. But I hope that that shifting balance is kind of productive over the course of the book, that the different balance of personal and research works well, I hope.
Yeah. So the book split up into different sections based on these different salt lakes across the globe, probably the majority in the Western US.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious what, obviously each watershed is really unique in many different ways, but what kind of commonalities did you see among these different salt lakes, both in terms of their kind of history and their present?
I guess early on, one of the things that was surprising to me was that are they are almost all in decline. That has to do with irrigation diversion. So the salt lakes, even though they're salty, depend on fresh water from rivers flowing in each year to kind of maintain the balance, since they lose a lot of water due to evaporation every summer.
Mm-hmm.
And over the last 100 years, humans have diverted those rivers across the world. So in the United States, a lot of that diversion is for alfalfa. In Central Asia, where the Aral Sea is kind of the largest, most serious case of a salt lake drying up, that was for cotton. But aside from that commonality, I think, sort of speaking more conceptually, it was interesting to see that many of the lakes have somewhat similar mythologies. I think, it was interesting to read about the different cultures that have existed alongside the lakes, and the similarities kind of in the mythologies that surround the lake. So for instance, there's a chapter about the Zuni Salt Lake, which is in New Mexico. And there the salt is considered the flesh of a goddess. Mm-hmm. In Central Asia, in Kyrgyzstan, there's a lake that's called Issyk-Kul. It doesn't have a chapter in the book, but it has a very similar mythology where one of the stories, they have about like 3 different origin stories for the lake, but one of them is actually a woman crying. So the salt is it's not the flakes of flesh, it's the tears, but it's sort of a similar story of like a woman's emotion being part of the creation of the salt lake.
Yeah. Yeah. What did you find just sort of in general? I think there's a tendency sometimes to focus on, and I definitely am guilty of this, to put on my kind of like science hat and focus on the geology or the ecology and forget about the communities that, these lakes support, and are, and the communities that are, actively working to prevent the continued decline of some of these lakes. And I know that in the book you talk about going to Salt Lake City, and the Great Salt Lake is probably the most prominent, at least in the Western U.S., of all the salt lakes in terms of the frequency that it's been written about in terms of its decline. I'm really curious, like how people kind of organize around these lakes and what you see in terms of the sort of community support for these lakes and community connections and involvement in these lakes.
I think it's really varied, and that's kind of amazing. One of the early cases of organizing around a salt lake that is one of the most impactful in terms of water law is at Mono Lake in Eastern California, which is a lake that I think many Californians are familiar with. Maybe not all know it's salty, but I think it's a famous place in California in its way. And there, a group of environmentalists and biology students in the 1970s became concerned that it was drying up, and ended up doing a baseline study that helped mount a legal case that made it so that the state determined that they had the right to oversee water rights, so that, and even if an entity held a water right that wasn't their private property, the state actually had the responsibility to continue to oversee that property, that water right, sorry. And in the event that there was an issue like a lake drying up, the state could step in and say, in the case of Mono, what it said was, you have to change the use of this water right so that the lake will come back to a certain elevation. But the state actually now reserves the right to even take the water right back. That's a California case. And that's been sort of precedent setting for other cases around the West, right? I think you're familiar with the Nevada case. There's a Utah court case where they're trying to hammer this out right now. And in Idaho, there was actually a preemptive decision of the state cannot come in and take water rights. So that's one way that salt lakes have actually, really impacted Western water law. But more recently, I think, there are religious communities that are involved at salt lakes. There are youth communities that are involved at salt lakes. There are more traditional environmental communities. And it's been, especially in Salt Lake City, where it's a big city right next to Salt Lake, it's been really impressive to see just the diversity of different groups that have become engaged in the lake.
Yeah, I want to come back to the lawsuits in a second because it is a particular interest of mine how these salt lakes have. Um, I probably should have just disclosed in the beginning that I am a huge Salt Lake fan. Also, going around the Great Basin, going to a lot of these lakes, but um, I am really curious. Like, I think that sometimes maybe I'm a little too optimistic, which is not something I'm usually guilty of, but I'm a little too optimistic in this regard, which is, we have this idea that water divides people, and it does in a lot of ways. It creates a lot of conflict, but um, I also think that it can bring people together. And I'm curious if you've seen in the organizing around the Great Salt Lake, for instance, um, what types of groups are coming together. If you're seeing, um, maybe surprising coalitions or unexpected coalitions coming together around saving these lakes.
Yeah, I think that it's true that while water is a divisive topic, it also is something that people are willing to cooperate over. Um, there was a talk recently here in Tucson, where I live, at the University of Arizona, where someone was saying just this, that actually we've expected that the next war will be over water, but in fact, in contemporary zones of war, water is sort of the one thing that there's been cooperation over. And so I think that there is oddly cause for optimism, even as due to, climate change and other factors, the situation with water is getting more grave. But I would say in the case of Salt Lake City, one sort of surprising group that I wrote a lot about in the book is that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which is sort of commonly known as the Mormon Church, has played a somewhat surprisingly large role, surprising to many people, in trying to have a role in saving the Great Salt Lake. That was something that I started reporting on while I was at High Country News, when I had a conversation with a coworker who said, I think we should cover religion in the West more. And I sort of had like a light bulb go off of like, oh wow, well, I wonder what, what's going on in Salt Lake City with that church and Salt Lakes. And it turned out there was quite a bit. They made a pretty substantial water rights donation. The church has tried to change some of its rhetoric around water use, which for many years people considered to be pretty profligate in terms of maintaining bright green lawns and that kind of thing. And so that's been, I think, a really powerful thing, a powerful sort of X factor in Salt Lake City that other Salt Lakes don't necessarily have a major church headquartered right next to them. And so I think that's a pretty neat case of an unexpected entity being involved in a Salt Lake fight.
Yeah. So I promised I was going to get back to the lawsuit, your answer about Mono Lake, and I think I guess people refer to it as like the National Audubon lawsuit, right? Or at Mono Lake,
Yeah.
because they were one of several plaintiffs, I think, in the.
Yeah, the name officially is, I think, National Audubon Society versus Superior Court.
Okay.
I believe that's the official name.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there were multiple plaintiffs. Yeah.
Yeah, and like you were saying, that created this public trust doctrine concept that allows the state to come in and balance public interests against the appropriation of private water rights, or the property right to use water, not own water. And I think it's a really interesting case because it starts in this Salt Lake. It stems from this Salt Lake, but like you said, it really is applicable to water law more broadly. The public trust doctrine itself, and also this larger question of balancing the ownership of water belonging to the public in Western states and the appropriation of water for private or economic uses. And I'm curious, in your research, as you mentioned, like several Salt Lakes have been involved in public trust litigation, or that has, in at least the case of California and Nevada, created precedent for the whole state. And I'm curious if in your reporting you found any kind of or have any thoughts on why it is that Salt Lakes reveal to us this sort of tension between public ownership of water belonging to the public and the appropriation of water for economic uses.
That's a really good question. Like, why are Salt Lakes consistently the test case for this massive concept? Yeah. So yeah, I guess the loyal readers of your Substack will know very well what the public trust doctrine is. But in a nutshell, it's this idea that the state has the right to oversee. Actually, not even the right. The state has the responsibility to oversee and conserve the waters within its boundaries. And it's an idea that comes from ancient Rome, but then it went into English law, and then it came into United States law. And it, at the start, was really for commerce. It was that you need to protect rivers so that boats, cargo ships can navigate them. But a law professor named Joseph Sachs wrote an article that suggested that maybe also the responsibility could apply to uses like recreation and ecology. And so Mono Lake really became the test case for that idea that the state has the responsibility to conserve this water body in its borders because of its ecological, its aesthetic, its, just sort of personal value to the people who live there. It's not a particularly commercially valuable lake. It's not like a steamship is crossing it, and it needs to be able to get across. So I think that the reason, maybe to sort of get to the end of that question, is that Salt Lakes are the endpoint of water systems in much of the West. So because they, like I explained, they form at the bottom of closed valleys, that means that when the river systems are kind of broken upstream, it's the lake that really shows it. Because if you've got this diversion happening. Maybe you're not going to see the diversion in the riverbed itself, but you'll definitely see it in the falling lake level. And so the lake is sort of the obvious place. And that's true, for instance, in Utah, right? That the Great Salt Lake is showing its desiccation very fast because it's a pretty shallow lake. And so whatever sort of amount of whatever drop in elevation it has, it really shows on the surface area.
Yeah.
And so I think that sort of Salt Lakes as the end point of the system has a lot to do with why they become the object of contention.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I do think that they sort of like are a almost, I don't know what the right, not a litmus. I don't want to say a litmus test because that's not exactly what I mean, but they are almost, they're sort of like a code red symptom of the larger system. Um, Whether we see them connected to the larger system or not, like they are the sort of outcome of all these decisions upstream. I I know we've talked a lot about kind of the shrinking of salt lakes globally, and of course that's a big part of the book is kind of looking at the decline of these lakes, and the loss of this habitat ecosystem, what that has meant for communities, over the past century of water development in the West. And I'm curious, kind of, and I know you write about this in your book and connect it to some of your own personal experiences as well. But I'm curious how you kind of view the theme of loss and concept of loss in when we're talking about these issues. And it applies to Salt Lakes, of course, but it applies to a lot of water issues in the West. Kind of,
Yeah.
I'm curious sort of how you've been thinking about that as you've written the book and since, uh, as you're sort of now in this next stage of talking about the book.
Right. It's an important question. I think that when I was writing the book and, even just in my life before even starting the book, I was reading a lot of writers who write about nature, write about the American West. And it was interesting to me to kind of compare the other eras that they were writing in with the present day era where I feel like, and I don't think I'm the only person who feels this way, I guess, but that sort of the issue of climate change really overwhelms so much of how we think about the environment, that there is this sort of sense of like imminent change, destruction of a certain kind, and loss of what we have known about the environment. So that everything always feels very kind of elegiac. And so it was partially for me kind of this literary exercise of, well, how do I sort of metabolize these authors that I really respect and revere and find beautiful, but also look at what's happening in my surroundings, which is different than what was happening in the era of, Wallace Stegner, or of, even in sort of Terry Tempest Williams' book Refuge about the Great Salt Lake it is about loss, very much about loss, but it's a moment when the lake was extremely high, and that was causing the issues. And so, I wanted to really write about the sort of the sort of emotional structure feeling of the current moment of environmentalism. And it was really interesting, I think, in that process, and took me by surprise, that started interviewing the religious groups who are involved with the lake, or doing the archival research about different sort of ways that religious communities have involved at the lakes, was a big sort of part of helping me think about how to approach the issue of loss in the environment.
Yeah. Where do you see, I guess the flip side of that question kind of is, what do you see sort of being built from there? Like what, you have evidence of loss in all sorts of natural systems and all sorts of different places across the globe. I guess, like, and particularly with Salt Lake. So what do you see as sort of moving to the next phase? Like, what can kind of maybe be built, or what does recovery look like um, in the face of that kind of loss?
Yeah, I guess sort of in addition to the interviews that I did or reporting I did with spiritual communities, the other major framework that I was kind of thinking about in writing the book was this very academic idea of queer ecology, which has to do with celebrating or even just paying attention to diversity in the natural world that doesn't conform to the normal type of biological reproduction that we're taught in ninth grade or whatever. But it also that's sort of the intro to queer ecology, is like there are these really unusual forms of reproduction that brine shrimp have, or brine fly, like Salt
Yeah.
Lakes, every single creature that lives there reproduces in a really bizarre way. So it's a
Yeah.
great case study in
Yeah.
queer ecology. But there's also another piece of queer ecology, which is the sort of approach to landscapes and approach to even ecology in a very broad sense. And I think that that's where I found some kind of like future thinking about loss of landscapes, where part of the sort of queer ecology approach to landscapes is that you have to, or I mean, not an obligation, but the idea that one ought to value a degraded landscape or a damaged landscape or an invaded, like novel ecology landscape, in the same way that one might value a sort of pristine, obviously beautiful, obviously biodiverse type of landscape. And so I think that was one key idea for me. When you look at a place like Owens Lake in California, is not really a lake anymore. It's a kind of engineering experiment zone. They've done an amazing job of controlling dust. It was the worst emitter of dust in the United States in the early 90s. And they have done an amazing job of essentially getting rid of that issue. It doesn't have very many days that are out of compliance in terms of PM10, the really small, fine dust particles anymore, but it doesn't look like a lake at all. And so you have to really kind of change the way you think about ecology to find it beautiful as a natural landscape. And yet, a lot of scientists have done work there showing that ecologically it has a lot of biodiversity. It brings a lot of birds. It's very productive in terms of the invertebrates. And so that, I think, is one type of futuristic thinking. And the other is, I think, there's also a queer ecology of loss that people have theorized. So there's a book that was something I read while I was doing the research for this book called Underflows. If I'm not getting that wrong, suddenly I'm worried I am. But it's by Cleo Wolfley Hazard, and that book has a line in it that says that something that Cleo Hazard brings to science as a queer and trans scientist is the sort of like queer understanding of loss, queer and trans understanding of loss, and that would be something that you would bring to science and be an asset to the way that you do science. And so that reading that I thought was also really valuable and interesting for thinking about salt lakes, where the idea that there are ways to think better about loss of ecosystems or to apply things that have been learned in the human world to the loss of ecosystems, I thought was pretty powerful.
Yeah. Yeah. I should say, in addition to just really enjoying the book, I was very impressed by your bibliography. I like on multiple occasions, and just citations in general, on multiple occasions, I like wrote down different authors' names, and I was like, I need to check out this person because it just weaves together a lot of really interesting writings and thinking about these places that are really unique and I think worthy of thinking about. Um, I guess my kind of last question for you is sort of, um, you had written pretty extensively, in this period where you're looking at Salt Lakes. I know you've written several essays that have been published in the interim, and have written a lot about these places. But in that process, what are some of the things that probably maybe most surprised you, even being fairly well versed in these places?
That's a hard question, but I it's a good question. I should have a good answer. I think that one thing that really took me by surprise was the case of Zuni Salt Lake, which I write about in the book, because I had been aware of the growing land back movement, right? That is sort of considered to have been started pretty recently by an indigenous activist and calling for land to be returned to tribes. And what I learned in doing the archival research for that chapter is that there is a historical reason that this movement didn't exist sooner, which is that Congress kind of closed the door to tribal land claims in the middle of the 20th century. And what is sort of amazing about the Zuni Salt Lake case is that they were able to get around it and have an actual case of the federal government returning land to a tribe. And so it was just really shocking for me to do this archival research and be like, wow, this is actually like a political possibility, and not everyone knows it's a political possibility, you know. So I felt like that was sort of a really thrilling archival moment for me to realize that was something that had a historical precedent that I think we can learn from in the present day.
Yeah, neat. Well, thank you so much. I really encourage everyone to pre-order this book and read it when it comes out. It was, it really threaded together so many different ideas and histories and kind of experiences of these lakes. And yeah, is there anything you want to add?
Just thank you so much for having me. I think that your Substack is one of the most comprehensive things out there for following what's going on with Western water loss. So I've learned a lot from it. And I say in the book that I really wouldn't have been able to write the Nevada chapters without Daniel's reporting. So yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Well, I really appreciate it. Yeah, I'm a big fan too. So yeah, it was just honestly, it was really fun for me to have a 30-minute chat with you. So thanks so much.
Thank you.